They sold out arenas. Their faces were on posters in every teenager's bedroom. Radio stations couldn't get enough of them. But when the music stopped, some of these legends found themselves with nothing left. No royalties, no safety net, no way back. These are 10 rock stars from the 1960s that died in poverty. Number 10. Frankie Lyman. There was a time when Frankie Lyman was the hottest teenager in America. Born in Harlem in 1942, he became the frontman of Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers at the age of just 13. The group's debut single, Why Do Fools Fall in Love, shot up the charts in 1956, hitting number 1 in the United Kingdom and cracking the top 10 in the United States. Lyman had a voice that seemed too big, too magnetic, too natural to belong to a kid still in middle school. He appeared on television, toured internationally, and became one of the first black teenage pop stars to cross over into mainstream American culture. Little girls screamed when he walked on stage. He was compared to Sammy Davis Jr. for his charisma and energy. The group appeared in 2 films, Rock 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 and Mr. Rock and Roll, and toured Britain where audiences at the London Palladium were completely taken with him. He was 13 years old and carrying himself like a veteran entertainer. For a brief, glittering moment, everything seemed possible. Then his voice broke. It was as simple and brutal as that. When puberty arrived, the high, soaring falsetto that had made Lyman famous simply disappeared. Record labels lost interest almost overnight. His solo career went nowhere. He bounced between managers, signed deals that gave him nothing, and watched the money dry up just as fast as the fame had. To cope with the pressure and the rejection, Lyman turned to heroin. He was using it by the time he was 15. He enlisted in the U.S. Army in 1966 in lieu of a jail sentence on a narcotics charge, went AWOL repeatedly, and was discharged dishonorably. By early 1968, he was back in New York, reportedly close to signing a new recording deal, the kind of comeback that always feels like it is just around the corner. On February 27, 1968, his body was found on the floor of his grandmother's bathroom in Harlem. A syringe lay beside him. He was 25 years old. He had been bankrupt when he died. His 3 wives, he had never properly divorced any of them, spent years in court fighting over what little remained. A music store eventually raised the funds to put a headstone on his grave. The royalties from Why Do Fools Fall in Love would later be worth millions in legal disputes. Frankie Lyman himself never saw a cent of them. Number 9. Syd Barrett. Roger Keith Barrett. Syd founded Pink Floyd in London in 1965. He was the creative engine of the group's earliest years, writing nearly all of their debut album The Piper at the Gates of Dawn, and giving the band a psychedelic, whimsical, and entirely singular identity. In the summer of 1967, Pink Floyd was one of the most talked about young bands in Britain, and Syd Barrett was at the center of all of it. A genuinely gifted songwriter who had that rare quality of making strange things feel completely natural. His songs mixed nursery rhyme language with surrealism and genuine melodic invention in a way that sounded effortless and was obviously anything but. People who saw him perform in that period later said there was something uncanny about him, an attention and a presence that was almost too intense.
Let's try it another way.
Then the LSD and the pressure and something more fragile underneath it all began to pull him apart. By early 1968, he was no longer able to function reliably within the band. He would stand on stage and not play or detune his guitar during a performance without explanation, or simply stare at the audience without moving. The rest of the band made the painful decision to replace him with David Gilmour. Pink Floyd went on to sell hundreds of millions of records. Barrett recorded 2 solo albums in 1970, Madcap Laughs and Barrett, before retreating from public life entirely. He moved back to Cambridge, to the house where he had grown up. He let his appearance change. He stopped talking about music with almost anyone. For the next 35 years, he lived quietly, painting and gardening, surfacing rarely and only reluctantly.
There is no other day.
The question of money in Syd Barrett's later life is a complicated one. He did receive some royalties from his years with Pink Floyd, but the life he lived in Cambridge was deliberately stripped down, and those who knew him described a man with very little in practical terms and very little interest in pursuing what might have been owed to him legally. He never sought remedy for the commercial success that was built, in significant part, on the identity and the songs he had created. Syd Barrett died of complications from diabetes on July 7, 2006, at the age of 60, in the same house in Cambridge where he had been born. He had spent nearly 4 decades in near total obscurity, while the music he helped set in motion filled stadiums around the world. Number 8. Skip James. Skip James never really made it the first time around. He recorded 18 songs for Paramount Records in 1931, dark, haunting, deeply strange blues that sold almost nothing during the Depression. He gave up music entirely, became a Baptist minister, worked manual labor jobs, and all but vanished from public life for 3 decades. Then, in 1964, a group of blues enthusiasts, John Fahey, Bill Barth, and Henry Vestine, tracked him down to a hospital in Tunica, Mississippi, and persuaded him to perform again. That summer, James appeared at the Newport Folk Festival and stunned the audience. He was 61 years old, ill, and had not performed professionally in over 30 years. Young rock musicians heard his recordings and could not believe what they were listening to. His cross-note D minor guitar tuning gave his music a haunting, eerie quality, unlike anything else in the blues canon. Cream, the British supergroup fronted by Eric Clapton, recorded his composition I'm So Glad on their 1966 debut album and made sure the songwriting credit went to James. The royalty check that followed, nearly $10,000, was the largest windfall of his entire musical life. But James was already battling cancer by the time that check arrived. He had spent most of his 1960s revival performing at folk festivals and college concerts for modest fees, chronically short of money, relying on the generosity of promoters just to get by. His widow later told Jack Bruce of Cream that the royalties from that one recording had done more for their family than everything James had earned across his entire career. That single sentence captures how the music industry worked for men like him. Skip James died of cancer on October 3, 1969, in Philadelphia. He was 67 years old and nearly penniless. The music he made in those brief recording windows, 1931 and the 1960s revival, is now considered some of the most original and influential blues ever put on tape. Number 7. Clyde McPhatter. Clyde McPhatter helped invent rock and roll. Born in Durham, North Carolina, in 1932, he became the lead tenor of Billy Ward and the Dominoes in the early 1950s, and his gospel-drenched vocal style influenced virtually every R&B and soul singer who came after him. His melismatic phrasing, that extraordinary ability to bend and ornament a melody the way a preacher bends words, was something he had absorbed from years of singing in church, and he brought it into secular music in a way that was genuinely new. When he left to form the Drifters in 1953, the group's very first recording, Money Honey, went straight to number 1 on the R&B charts. Jackie Wilson said openly that he had modeled his entire approach on watching McPhatter perform. Ben E. King, Smokey Robinson, Marv Johnson. The line of vocalists who absorbed and built on what McPhatter had done runs through decades of American popular music. Going solo in the mid-1950s, McPhatter scored a string of hits that made him a genuine star. A Lover's Question cracked the Pop Top 10 in 1958, and his influence on the sound of popular music was already enormous by then. He was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1987, a recognition that acknowledged what insiders had always known. But the 1960s were brutal to him. The British invasion rewrote the rules almost overnight, and artists like McPhatter, who had defined American cool just a decade earlier, found themselves being quietly dropped from radio playlists without explanation. He moved to England in the late 1960s, hoping to find work in clubs, but the same personal demons followed him across the Atlantic. His alcoholism deepened. Engagements were lost. The gigs that remained were smaller and further apart. He returned to the United States in 1970, living mostly as a recluse, making occasional appearances on revival tours. A final album for Decca Records went nowhere. In a 1971 interview, Clyde McPhatter told a journalist plainly, "I have no fans." Published accounts at the time of his death described him as broke and despondent over a career that had made him a legend, but left him with almost nothing to show for it. He died on June 13, 1972 in the Bronx of complications from heart, liver, and kidney disease brought on by years of heavy drinking. He was 39 years old. Many of the singers who built entire careers on his blueprint outlived him by decades.
I read a story the other day, guaranteed it.
Number 6. Florence Ballard.
So tenderly.
Florence Ballard was the one who named the Supremes. She was there at the very beginning, one of the founding members, a girl from the Brewster Douglas housing projects in Detroit, who started the group with Diana Ross and Mary Wilson back in 1961. She was, by many accounts, the most naturally powerful voice among them. She sang on 16 top 40 singles, including 9 #1 hits. For a time, the Supremes were the most successful female group anywhere on the planet. But Berry Gordy had his own vision of where the group was headed, and that vision centered increasingly on Diana Ross. By the mid-1960s, Ballard was being pushed further and further to the edges of the act she had helped create. She struggled with depression, began drinking, and started missing performances. In July 1967, she was forced out of the group entirely. She was 23 years old. The settlement Motown gave her was widely reported to be far less than what she was owed. The attorney who helped negotiate her departure was later found to have embezzled from the money she did receive. She lost that too. Her solo career produced 2 singles that went nowhere. She was dropped from ABC Records in 1970. The following year, a lawsuit against Motown for unpaid royalties was dismissed. By 1971, her home had been foreclosed. She applied for welfare in 1974. That story made the newspapers. Fans who remembered the gowns and the lights and the Ed Sullivan performances had no idea. She got sober. She bought a new home after receiving a legal settlement in 1975. She was starting to sing again, beginning to believe that maybe it was not too late. Then, on February 22, 1976, Florence Ballard died of cardiac arrest. She was 32 years old. 5,000 people attended her funeral, arriving in everything from mink coats to street clothes, standing together in the Detroit winter. One music critic called her death one of rock and roll's greatest tragedies. She was inducted posthumously into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1988.
So tenderly.
Number 5. Big Mama Thornton.
You ain't nothing but a hound.
Willie Mae Thornton recorded Hound Dog in 1952. Her version, raw, commanding, and entirely her own, stayed at the top of the R&B charts for 7 weeks and sold over 500,000 copies. Elvis Presley recorded his version 4 years later and became a cultural phenomenon. Big Mama Thornton never received meaningful royalties from that song. She was not just a blues singer, she was a force. Born in Montgomery, Alabama in 1926, she had taught herself harmonica and drums in addition to developing a voice that could fill a room without a microphone. She had worked her way up from the gospel and blues circuit in the Deep South throughout the 1940s and into a recording career with Peacock Records that showcased a power few artists in any era have matched. She also wrote Ball and Chain, which Janis Joplin performed at the 1967 Monterey Pop Festival to enormous response, delivering a rendition that made Joplin a star overnight. Again, the song brought Thornton renewed attention, and very little of the money that the cover version eventually generated. Her financial story is, in many ways, the story of how the recording industry treated black artists during those decades, contracts that signed away publishing rights for pennies, royalty statements that did not add up, managers who took their share and moved on. Thornton performed for decades, still appearing at festivals and clubs deep into the 1980s, but she was never compensated fairly for the music that built other people's fortunes. By the final years of her life, she was living in a single rented room in Los Angeles. The decades of performing and the drinking had taken a hard toll on her body. Willie Mae Thornton died on July 25, 1984, at the age of 57. The room she died in held almost nothing.
You ain't nothing but a hound.
Number 4. Harry Nilsson. Harry Nilsson is one of the great what-ifs of popular music. The The Beatles called him their favorite American artist. John Lennon and Ringo Starr were among his closest friends. In 1969, his recording of Everybody's Talkin' became the soundtrack to Midnight Cowboy and introduced him to millions. He followed it with a string of critically celebrated albums through the late 1960s and into the 1970s. At the peak of his fame, he signed a recording deal worth $5 million, reported at the time to be the largest deal in the history of the music business. He was not a natural performer. He preferred to work behind the scenes, writing and recording rather than touring. When John Lennon was living in Los Angeles in the early 1970s, the two of them spent a chaotic extended period together that Lennon later called the Lost Weekend. It lasted 18 months and did lasting damage to Nielsen's voice and his focus as an artist.
If living is without you, I can't.
His manager, Cindy Sims, had been quietly stealing from him for years. When the fraud was uncovered in 1991, Nielsen was left with almost nothing. Sims pleaded guilty to 3 counts of grand theft. Nielsen, by now supporting a family of 8, filed for bankruptcy. He was simultaneously battling creditors and serious heart problems, and he wrote in a letter to the bankruptcy court that his greatest fear in life had always been ending up broke. He was watching that fear come true. Harry Nilsson died of heart failure on January 15, 1994 at the age of 52. His estate filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. His net worth at the time of his death was recorded as negative $1 million. The man the Beatles called their favorite American musician left his family with debts instead of an inheritance. Number 3. Screamin' Jay Hawkins.
I put a spell on you.
Jalassie Hawkins, better known as Screamin' Jay Hawkins, was one of the most original performers in the history of rock and roll. His 1956 recording of I Put a Spell on You was banned on multiple radio stations for what programmers called its disturbing and unseemly nature. He performed Rising from a Coffin. He carried a skull on stage he called Henry. He wore capes and theatrics that looked perfectly at home in the shock rock that followed him decades later. Alice Cooper and Marilyn Manson both named him as a direct influence on their approach to performance. Born in Cleveland, Ohio in 1929, Hawkins had been a legitimate jazz singer and a former Golden Gloves boxing contender before his 1956 single redirected his career entirely. The story of how I Put a Spell on You became the wild, screaming recording that got banned tells you something about the man. He and the band were reportedly so drunk in the studio that he had no memory of recording it, and what came out of that session was something completely unplanned and completely unforgettable. He spent the next 4 decades performing wherever he could find a stage: clubs, theaters, festivals, international tours. He was beloved by rock historians and by fellow musicians. But the commercial success that I Put a Spell on You deserved never converted into financial security.
I put a spell on you.
He toured constantly into old age, not because he wanted to, but because the income was necessary. When he died in February 2000 following surgery in Paris for a brain aneurysm, it emerged that he had fathered at least 57 children with women across multiple countries, most of them without knowing about each other. Paternity claims had been stacking up for years. The estate he left behind was chaos. Screamin' Jay Hawkins died on February 12, 2000, at the age of 70. He had almost nothing to leave any of those children. The skull named Henry outlasted the man who carried it. The music, strange and alive as ever, did too.
I put a spell on you.
Number 2. Little Willie John.
I get a feeling that's so hard to bear. You give me fever.
Before James Brown, before Marvin Gaye, before any of the great soul voices of the 1960s had their names on marquees, there was Little Willie John. Born in Cullendale, Arkansas in 1937 and raised in Detroit, William Edward John was barely 17 when he signed with King Records in 1955. By 1956, at 18, he had recorded Fever, a song that became one of the defining performances of the rock and roll era. He was 5'4" and 126 pounds, but when Little Willie John stepped to the microphone, the room changed. His voice had a range and emotional depth that James Brown later credited as one of his greatest influences. Peggy Lee covered Fever and turned it into the signature record of her own career. The Beatles recorded his Leave My Kitten Alone. Fleetwood Mac covered Need Your Love So Bad. John produced 14 top 10 R&B singles between 1955, and 1960, and performers from Sam Cooke to Jackie Wilson acknowledged the debt they owed to his phrasing and his instinct for a melody. He had won a talent contest judged by Count Basie at age 14. He was that kind of talent, the kind that is obvious to everyone who hears it.
No one can love you the way I do, 'cause they don't know.
But offstage, Little Willie John carried a short temper that his small frame only seemed to intensify. He drank heavily. He was arrested multiple times. In 1964, at an after-hours party in Seattle following a performance, he stabbed a man during a brawl. The man died. John was convicted of manslaughter in 1966 and sentenced to 8 to 20 years at Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla. He had no money when he went in. The hits had dried up, the contracts had expired, and the legal battles had drained whatever was left. In prison, his health fell apart fast. James Brown visited him in the spring of 1968 and later described finding his former inspiration wheelchair-bound, hacking from pneumonia. On May 26, 1968, Little Willie John died at the age of 30. The official cause on his death certificate was a heart attack, though rumors of violence and neglect have followed the story ever since. James Brown recorded a full tribute album in his memory that same year. Willie John was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1996. None of that came in time to do him any good.
I get a feeling that's so hard to bear, you give me fever.
Number 1. Don Drummond. Don Drummond was one of the most gifted jazz and ska musicians of his generation, and one of the founding members of the Skatalites, the Jamaican band that created the musical bedrock from which reggae would eventually grow. Born in Kingston in 1932, he trained at the Alpha Boys School, a Catholic reform institution that produced a remarkable number of Jamaica's most important musicians. The nuns who ran the school recognized early that he had an extraordinary ear and technical ability on the trombone that went far beyond what most musicians ever develop. They gave him what formal training they could and let the rest take care of itself. By the time the Skatalites formed in 1964, Drummond's playing was already considered legendary in Jamaican music circles. The group backed virtually every significant Jamaican artist of the era: Toots Hibbert, Jimmy Cliff, Alton Ellis, and many others. Drummond's own compositions were dark and dense and deeply original, drawing on jazz, Caribbean folk, and a musical imagination that was entirely his own. Tracks like Eastern Standard Time and Man in the Street are still studied by serious musicians today. He compressed something immense into those recordings: urgency and melancholy and technical mastery all at once. But Don Drummond suffered from severe mental illness for much of his adult life. He was admitted to Bellevue Hospital, a psychiatric institution in Kingston, multiple times throughout the years when the Skatalites were recording their most important work. The tension between his extraordinary gift and the illness that shadowed it never resolved. On New Year's Day 1965, during an acute crisis, he stabbed and killed his girlfriend, the dancer Anita Mahfood, who had been known professionally as Margarita. He was found not guilty by reason of insanity and committed indefinitely to Bellevue. He never left. He had no money. He had no freedom. The window of recording he had shared with the Skatalites, barely 12 months from 1964 to 1965, had produced some of the most vital instrumental music the Caribbean had ever generated. None of that changed what came after. Don Drummond died in Bellevue Hospital on May 6, 1969. He was 36 years old. He is remembered today as one of the most important musicians Jamaica has ever produced. He died with nothing in a psychiatric ward, unable to touch a trombone. Before you go, these stories share something beyond the poverty itself. A lot of these musicians were exploited by contracts written specifically to make sure they never received what they earned. Some were robbed by people they trusted. Some were simply left behind by an industry that moved on the moment the money stopped flowing, without a backward glance at the people who had built it. And some found that fame, no matter how loud and bright it burns, leaves very little warmth once it goes out. What makes these stories worth telling is not just the tragedy, it is how much these people gave. They shaped popular music in ways we still hear today. In every arena rock anthem, every soul ballad, every overdriven guitar, they gave the world something lasting and received very little in return. If their stories stayed with you, hit the like button and subscribe. There are more stories like these waiting, and every one of them deserves to be told.